Good afternoon. I'm Peter Panepento, Assistant Managing Editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Gene Case, the CEO of the Case Foundation. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about why millennials matter. And maybe you could start just by talking a little bit about the Case Foundation's role with millennials and how you've been incorporating millennials into the work you do.
Sure. Well, you know, at the Case Foundation, we like to say we invest in people and ideas that can change the world. And when we look at millennials, we think they're really a change the world generation, and it really excites us. And so they've really been a big part of our work from the very beginning. The Case Foundation is made up largely of millennials on its staff. A lot of our initiatives are about millennials and with millennials. And so we just think that they're an integral part to the role we want to play in this sector.
Okay. We've seen a lot of organizations be a little more resistant to that. They, you know, the hierarchy of the organizations are older and they're more established, and they're not necessarily sure how to engage millennials in their operations and the work they do. Why do you think it's important that they break out of that?
Yeah, so it's funny, Peter, you know, because I obviously am not a millennial.
Nor am I. So.
My husband and I started our careers in technology, and our experience was that we were a lot younger than the people that we were working with. But we really wanted respect, and we really wanted to be understood for the ideas that we might have. And you know, it seems only natural to us to look across now at many generations and ask them to be a part of our work. A lot of the innovations in the great companies we know and love today really were started by folks in their 20s. And so we want to take that same kind of innovation, that same kind of scale and opportunity that some of the great companies have brought forward and apply that in the social sector. And we do think the participation of young people in that will be an important part of it.
Sure. So tell me a little bit about how the young people in your organization have influenced the culture and some of the work you're doing. Maybe we can talk a couple of examples of that.
Yeah, well, I think we've talked before, you know, I think this generation is known for a couple of different characteristics, and one of them is breaking down the silos. So our work at the Case Foundation is very much cross-sector collaboration, meaning we include the private sector, the nonprofit sector, philanthropy, and the public sector. And one of the things we really love and value about millennials is when they think about changing the world, they don't think about it the way my generation did. They don't say, okay, I'm going to go into business and I'm going to do this thing to make this difference, or I'm going into government. They say, there's a challenge or an opportunity I'm trying to meet, and I don't really care, you know, which sort of perspective I bring to it. I just want to change the world. So that helps us, I think, constantly have a fresh perspective on, you know, a big way to look at it that's more blended in terms of sectors instead of just these old siloed ways of approaching problems.
Sure. And in terms of the organizations you support or you work with regularly, where are you seeing some interesting innovation or new ideas that are engaging younger folks?
Yeah, so there are some, you know, really great organizations led by millennials that we've supported, and we try to champion and hold up their work as great models. We had Barbara Bush with us here last week. Barbara came to us very early with her vision for the Global Health Corps, which engages millennials as fellows, and work that basically brings innovation to healthcare work, not just around the globe, but then bring it back to the United States. It's a little bit of Teach for America, if you will, is tilted towards healthcare. So we think Barbara is a great model of a millennial in that she innovated in the approach she saw to address a great healthcare challenge. You know, she had a big vision. She was pretty fearless and willing to take risks in terms of starting an organization and having some big goals. Mobilize.org, we've worked with for a long time, some, you know, additional great millennials leading there. David Smith at the National Conference on Citizenship. So, you know, there have been a number of different organizations where we've seen these young millennials go forward in a leadership kind of way and really make a difference.
So that's really encouraging to see, and we know this is a big generation in terms of its demographics and the role they're going to be playing down the line. One other thing that is important for nonprofits, foundations, and other in philanthropy world to understand is how to engage millennials, not just as employees, but as volunteers and as donors. I think there's a misperception out there that millennials, either because of economic circumstances or because of where they are, aren't giving, but we're seeing numbers that go in the other direction of that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, I think the generation takes an unfair hit you know, for their slacktivism, when in fact the level of engagement and the passion that we see coming forward out of this generation is unprecedented. I mean, we really have seen some remarkable data in terms of the level at which they're giving of their time and their money. And one of the things I think we learned from the Peace Corps early on is if you can engage someone early in their life in a cause that they care about and that they're passionate about, chances are they'll stay engaged in a meaningful way in society through their lifetimes. So I think we'll see that in this generation. I know it's been our own experience here. Of course, we saw this in the last election where there was a lot of engagement of millennials. But I think one of the things we see in almost every initiative we take on is millennials are quick to the table and deeply engaged with us in this work.
So what motivates them, and what do you think is the secret sauce for a nonprofit or a foundation that wants to build those relationships? What can they do to make that happen?
Making this even more remarkable when you think about what motivates them and how they stay upbeat and a belief that they can change the world. Think about what they've been through as a generation, right? 9/11, Katrina, the tsunami, 2 wars, things, almost any one of them would make you go, ugh, it's a big old world out there, lots of problems. But instead, what we've seen is honestly this optimism, this belief that we can make things better by jumping in, by playing some role. Again, whether that's time, whether that's money, or whether that's advocacy, just some way that they can come in and play a role. What motivates them, it's interesting, some other characteristics. Obviously, it's a very highly educated, the most educated generation that we've seen come in the United States. Very diverse. I think that diversity has really added a lot because they get the benefit of other perspectives that maybe I didn't have as I was growing up because my communities were not as diverse. And you just sort of think about that sort of world perspective that comes out of those events I just talked about. So I don't know, what are the keys to what motivates them, but I know all of that plays some kind of role.
You and your husband came out of really the first tech internet wave of both, how the internet grew, but also how giving came as an offshoot of that. We're starting to see kind of the echo boom of that now happening with millennials. Do you see any similarities between the tech entrepreneurs now and what they might want to do with society and what you've been able to do?
I do, and we're really excited about it because particularly driven by social media, and it is, the Case Foundation has been actively involved in trying things and putting forth new pilots to try different things at the social media level to engage millennials, but really donors at all levels. And so I think, one of the things that we got excited about very early on with social media was it was a new technology that came forward that right from the beginning it became clear how this was going to be used for good. And what I've said is the technology cycles I had been through in my professional career, and as you know, my private sector career was spent in technology, I really hadn't seen technologies that almost right at the start somebody thought about how could we use this for good. And the beautiful thing about social media is it's that, and a big part of that is because it was driven by these millennials who, technology is more in their DNA, so of course you're going to use these new technologies for that part of your life that's about changing the world.
And it can happen in much smaller acts that way than it could in the past too. So we talked a little bit about slacktivism, but in a way, if you spin that around, that's actually something that is potentially very useful and powerful. Right?
I think that's right. I think that's right. And we're seeing this particularly play out. There are a number of different giving platforms. We have invested in just 3 of them, for instance, that together have raised over $1 billion in micro donations. A large part of those micro donations came from millennials and came from their level of activism. That's Causes on Facebook, that's Network for Good, and that's Mission Fish on eBay. And we were really excited when Causes came along on Facebook, another example of a new platform and new technology that very early on had a little bit of a focus that was on doing good.
Where do you see this all going? What do you think is the vision for this generation and their use of technology and giving and 10, 20 years down the line?
Right. So we get really passionate about the idea of democratizing philanthropy so that everybody says, I'm a philanthropist. It just shouldn't be about rich people writing checks. So we think that's a very exciting dynamic that we hope plays out even more in the days and years ahead. And as part of that, we're also excited about the idea of everyday philanthropy. And here again, I think millennials can play an important role, and we're seeing some of this today. So for instance, if you buy a cup of coffee, wouldn't it be great if you bought it from that one, something good happens. And when an organization or a company makes a decision that if you buy their products and services, or if you engage with them, something good happens as a response. The beautiful thing about that is it wouldn't make you do anything different in your day, but when you go about your normal behavior, maybe something good will happen because you participated with this company or with this product or service. So we see a lot of upside there. We think that the surface has just been scratched.
Okay.
And the technologies, I think, that will really help enable that is, the growth of mobile, the explosion of mobile. We have about 4 billion phones in the world, cell phones in the world. A quarter of them are smartphones. The kind of transactions that can happen for good because you have a walk around in your pocket mobile device, they're really, they're countless ways.
Okay, interesting. What do you think are some of the challenges that both nonprofits, foundations, and just society in general has in terms of bringing out the best in this generation?
Well, it's interesting because I talked about this generation kind of having technology in their DNA. We've worked very hard to make sure that the nonprofit comes up to speed, we and others, in training the nonprofit sector around how to leverage these technologies. I think there is a big challenge, but it's also an opportunity for whether it's governments, whether it's nonprofits, and by the way, philanthropy too, to really embrace new technology, use it as their bridge and a connection point to this generation. And I think what they'll find is, in some cases, they'll lead millennials and other donors to new things and open their eyes. But in some ways, millennials and the other donors will open their eyes and inform their work, and I think make it better and stronger and more effective in the long run.
Interesting. I've really noticed a big shift in the nonprofit world over the last 5 years in terms of the embracing of technology. It seems like 5 years ago, the mantra was that nonprofits were really slow, they were behind the times. I think social media has really changed that a lot.
You're right, Peter,
Yeah. So in some ways, I think the nonprofit world is actually, pushing a lot of innovation. I think we're starting to see actually government and business actually follow the nonprofit world a little bit.
Yeah, and that's been exciting, and I agree with you. We've seen the same thing, and I think the data is borne out on that in some cases, there was even a period of time, I want to say about a year or two ago, where some of the studies said they're actually leading on that front. But what I will say is, I have seen a lot of innovation, but I also believe it's a mixed bag. I think we've seen a tremendous amount of innovation from a number of nonprofits, but as a sector overall, there's still a lot of work to do to make sure everyone's at the table, everyone's engaging in a meaningful way. But I think that's true in any sector. There's a mixed bag. There's some that are ahead of the pack, and some are still kind of coming from behind.
Absolutely. That's disruption is kind of the name of the game in every industry right
definitely,
now.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I think that kind of ties back to millennials again. I mean, they are really coming of age during a time of great upheaval, both socially, economically, and just in how the world works. And I would imagine that does actually motivate behavior that makes you feel like you can both change things and want to make things better.
I think that's right. It's the 15th anniversary of the Case Foundation this year, and so just last week we launched a campaign called Be Fearless. And what was really behind that thinking was, as we turned 15 and said, gee, what should we do? We decided we would hit the pause button and take a look around and look back, both at our work and the work of our partners. And as you know all too well, given the coverage that you guys do all the time, too many of our challenges in society are still daunting. They haven't seen a lot of progress. But there have been some real bright lights. And so we took this opportunity to look around and to say, what's behind those places where there's been breakthroughs, where there's been transformational change? And what we discovered was it usually had something to do with somebody, acting boldly, making big bets, taking risks, trying new things, or collaborating with others. And so it became clear that there were almost a set of principles or characteristics around what fearless work looks like that drives change. So I think the really exciting thing about millennials is that Be Fearless spirit, that comes to them much more naturally. And so, I think you and I have talked before, one of the things I try to do in the organizations we spend time with is really encourage them to make sure they're not just serving or talking to millennials, but that millennials are at the table in a meaningful way. I believe millennials should be on boards, in key management, in places where decision-making and strategy is being carved out. And in some cases that's too radical for some nonprofits, but you could have these side-by-side advisory boards or other structures you put in place. So the voice and the value of the millennial is really deeply ingrained in the work that you take forward.
Interesting. So what are you hoping Be Fearless produces down the line? What type of, in best case scenario, what would you like that to look like?
Yeah. So we've said it's really a call to those that are involved in finding and funding solutions to old problems. That's really what the messaging is about. That's who we're asking that we link arms with. That's what the call goes out to. And by the way, it goes out to ourselves every day. I mean, in fact, one of the reasons we decided that this might be powerful to work together with our partners on is because internally, when we started asking ourselves, were we being fearless? Too often we discovered, you know what, sometimes caution is first. Sometimes fear does guide how we're thinking about this. And when we can unleash ourselves from that and really be willing to take measured risk, right, not crazy risk, not you know, throwing all cares to the wind or whatever, you know, that's really when the breakthroughs start to happen. So what we're hoping is that together as a sector, if we can agree, you know what, we all do need to accept that sometimes failure might happen. And if it happens, learn from it. Don't be ashamed of it. Share what you learned in hopes that others can go a little further faster. And as a sector, we should all move forward, I think, at a better pace than I think we found in the past.
Failure is such an important thing, and a lot of nonprofits, foundations, businesses, everybody really seems like they do act with caution a lot and are afraid to fail. Maybe, do you have an example of your own, from your own experience, either in business or in the foundation world?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have had quite a few failures, and I think there's just not enough conversation around when we fail, and it's not comfortable.
Right.
So we had a situation with our water initiative, our global water initiative, in which we really came to a place where we said, you know what, this is not working. What are we going to do about it? And we had a couple of options, right? We had the option of trying to sweep it under the rug, maybe not talking about it, you know, kind of covering it up, going forward, et cetera. We had the option of distancing ourselves from it, of doing a lot of different things, maybe trying to play the blame game a little. Really, it messed up, and it wasn't our fault. And so instead we said, you know, why don't we just be transparent? You know, this isn't working, and really it was the best intention by everybody involved, but it's not working and something has to change. So we made some decisions about how to do what we call pivot, or change things up and start a new path, learning from those mistakes. But most importantly, I wrote a very public blog, which to this day I had more positive response from than anything I've ever written or talked about. And it became clear to me that there's just a crying need for us to acknowledge when things don't go right and to feel comfortable sharing those lessons with others.
Sure.
That, you know, all of us, if we're trying new things, we're going to fail from time to time. And, you know, there's some really famous quotes about, you know, if you're not failing regularly, you're not trying hard enough. You can't have breakthrough innovation as you're trying to change the world for the better unless you're trying new things, and you can't really try a lot of new things without an occasional failure here and there.
Sure. Well, I don't want to dwell on failure too much. You've made it 15 years as a foundation. I'm sure you have some ideas for what you would like to accomplish over the next 15 years with all these millennials helping to shape it. What are some of the things you see moving forward that you'd like to do?
So, you know, it's a really common question that we get, and I think one of the things that we've realized, even in our year-to-year planning, long before we get to sort of long-term planning, is that some of the best opportunities that emerged couldn't have even been on a piece of paper, because the things we leveraged or the ideas that came about didn't exist, you know, 5 years ago, right? This is true in our society with the pace of change.
Sure.
We don't know the great opportunities we're going to have going forward to leverage certain ways to bring more people to good, to try to work with other organizations, et cetera. But we really enjoy this space. Our focus is on leadership, collaboration, and entrepreneurship. We use technology, and we invest in people and ideas that can change the world. And I think that's going to stay our focus. But how that tilts, you know, from any one cycle to another, I think you'll see change year to year.
Interesting. So I saw that recently you've done some work with prizes and challenges. I know that that's been part of your culture here for a little bit of time looking back too.
Yeah.
What are your takeaways from that, and how do you think that relates to the work that millennials are doing and the work you're doing with millennials?
Sure. Well, you know, we've had the true privilege of now having done 2 conferences with the White House on the subject of prizes and challenges, and our first was actually 2 years ago. And at that time, there was just a belief that there was a renaissance in the use of prizes and challenges to really drive innovation. You know, it's actually less about the prize side and more about the challenge side. Okay. That in the private sector, we had clearly recognized that where big challenges were put forth and a call to go meet them, all kinds of heat and momentum came around those things. So we've seen this play out in terms of finding new solutions in solar energy, in terms of, building better, faster modes of transportation that are more fuel efficient. I mean, we could go right down the line, all the different things that have come about. And typically what we find is that prizes and challenges do a really unique job of engaging citizens in solutions for their communities that they care about. And their community might be their neighborhood, but it might be their nation, and it might be the globe, right? I mean, it depends on the challenge. But it also can find untapped experts. People sitting out there with truly great ideas, and in some cases these might be sort of untitled citizens. In some cases these might be the brightest minds working on things, but no one ever said, come be part of the solution and help us figure out this big problem. So we think millennials are uniquely suited to play a role in this whole idea of prizes and challenges across the sector. Our role with the White House was to really support and champion the work of federal agencies. It led to something called challenges.gov. And there have been, just in the last 2 years since we launched these series of experiments, 196 different challenges put out there by 46 different agencies. So a lot of traction and fun stuff, and I would just encourage millennials to take a look at challenges.gov and find some exciting ways that maybe they'll be able to plug in and be part of the solution in their government.
Okay, interesting. And bringing up the role of government, role of philanthropy, we're also seeing a lot of activity in what is called the social entrepreneur space.
That's
and
right.
I feel like millennials are also playing a pretty key role in that world too. Where do you see that in terms of how it interacts with traditional philanthropy, and what do you think is the future of social entrepreneurship?
I'm super excited about social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And all these things have different titles to different people, but the whole idea of using entrepreneurial talents and entrepreneurial approach to solve problems, but maybe do it through the prism of a company, maybe do it through the prism of a nonprofit too. We see it working on both sides. Very excited by that. As I think you know, Peter, I sit on the Social Enterprise Initiative at the Harvard Business School, which is a board, and we're just really jazzed at the amount of traction we're seeing in the impact investing front, which is really a call out to foundations and to academia and really organizations with endowments to use some of their core endowment funds to make investments in social entrepreneurs who are out to change the world. It's quite common that foundations will grant money out of their grant dollars to do that. Less common that they'll apportion some of their endowment to actually go toward good, if you will. And what we're finding is that some of these really great social enterprise opportunities that exist, or impact investing opportunities that exist, can bring a return. So it's a little different than a grant where you write the check, it's gone, and I don't ever see it again. In impact investing, I think the really exciting thing is not only are you side-by-side investors, but you'll get that money back, and maybe you'll get some more money too. So we think it makes a lot of sense for foundations to look hard at this, and we see millennials playing a really strong role in terms of guiding the way of social entrepreneurs and new models that they're taking forward.
Now, we talked about fear of failure, and foundations by their nature are very conservative organizations in a lot of cases. Are you seeing signs that there are pockets of change in that
So
area?
there are a few brave souls out front who are taking the arrows in the back. But it'll be interesting, and we kind of debate this in the sector a little bit, and those of us trying to really drive some impact investing. We debate whether it's actually going to be the traditional organizations with the big endowments who will really be driving a lot of this, or will it be individuals who are a little more, willing to take a risk, willing to fail, willing to lose a little money, which, in the investment world, you always have that mindset, right? Particularly around venture, this would be more, closely aligned with. When you make venture investments, you better make a lot of them because you're going to lose on some, and you hope you make it up in the few that actually score. So, this is one place where the risk tolerance has to be there for an organization, because chances are not all of them are going to be successful. But I'm hopeful that just like in venture, there'll be a few true breakthrough transformative successes that will in the end make investors go, that was a smart thing I did, and I believe in the future of impact investing.
What role do you think millennials are going to play in changing those cultures over time? We've talked a little bit already about the fact that a lot of groups have been slow to engage them in organizations.
Right.
How do we make sure that it happens at a good enough pace so opportunities aren't wasted,
Yeah.
and we lose a lot of folks from
Well,
being engaged.
it's an opportunity for leadership for the generation. You know, when I think about the strong venture funds that I know, there's usually some millennials helping, you know, to have a voice in where the investment goes. They're usually not the ones that are making the decisions, but they're in alignment or next to the people making the decisions around where investments will go. So, you know, I think millennials, this stuff comes more naturally to them because they are sort of out there on the risk curve. They're watching, you know, some of the more innovative things that are going on. So I think they can add great value to organizations, whether they be traditional organizations or new organizations that emerge, in helping them come up to speed just in this whole category more broadly. And then it wouldn't surprise me, and I'm hoping that some millennials step out and actually become some of the leads in putting together some of these impact investing funds and trying some new things.
Okay. We've spent a lot of time talking about how millennials are different and what they do that's different and how to engage them differently. But I think maybe we should talk a little bit about, you know, just kind of dispelling the myth that they're these, you know, green-headed Martians that are completely different from all the rest of us. What about millennials is actually true across generations? What, you know, what can bring everybody together in terms of understanding each other?
Yeah. So you and I have talked about this a little bit, and I think I said to you, boy, I really don't like being put in a box. Like, it makes me uncomfortable if somebody looks at, you know, some part of who I am or what I am, and then they draw conclusions. So we try really hard not to do that with millennials. At the same time, you know, I spend a lot of time talking to women on the subject of, you know, just sort of our gender overall and its tendencies. And I think, you know, most of us, depending on our profiles and our characteristics, have tendencies. And I think millennials have tendencies. Does it mean every one of them has that? No. But it means things that are more commonly associated with them. And some of those things are really positive, and we've talked about, you know, some of those things like, you know, their can-do spirit, they're willing to take risks, you know, just this whole idea that they believe they can change the world. Technology in their DNA. Those are definitely characteristics that generally apply to millennials. Most have them, some don't, etc. But on the negative side, there are tendencies as well. And, you know, find me a person that only has positive tendencies. They don't exist. So all of us have negatives. And I think that generation's negatives, you know, can be harnessed. And, you know, I think if they're on a radar screen, I think the average millennial can do a better job of managing through those negatives. So one that is really commonly talked about, I think, in the professional environment is, you know, as a generation, they don't particularly like hierarchy. Well, you know, sometimes that can be good because they can have a certain boldness that they bring forward with their ideas because they're not afraid of the hierarchy. But they also need to understand, just like the book The Outliers said, you know, you need about 10,000 hours at something before you're really great at it. And a patience that they need to bring that might not come so naturally to them. So that impatience, some might say, is a negative. I think it can be helpful as long as it's on a radar screen and they're saying, I know when I should be impatient and I know when I just need to say, okay, you know, I have to let this sort of play out a little bit and not be impatient in a way that isn't helpful.
Sure. One thing I noticed out of the Millennial Donor Report is a truism that really goes across all generations too, and that's that millennials give to what they know. They tend to support organizations that they have a connection to. And that's really true of everybody. You know, I've covered fundraising for a long time, and really it comes down to relationships.
That's right.
And that really takes us back to the beginning of our conversation when we talk about the need for groups to build those relationships.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, you know this better than I do in philanthropy, churches and schools or, you know, places of worship and schools are often number one and number two because that's where people feel affiliation. But I think what social media will do, and as a result millennials behind it, will expose people to all kinds of causes that they might get really jazzed about that they otherwise would never have known about. And the great thing is it might come to them because a friend has brought it to their attention. And I think that whole idea of coming from a trusted source, and first might be family and friends on that, that's the big opportunity, I think, with social media and giving in this generation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's been fun.
It definitely has.
Appreciate you being here.
Hopefully we can talk again soon on this.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.